Welcome to my channel, The Earth. Today we are delving into a crucial topic, climate change. The first question I have for you is, do you see any signs of climate change? The answer is yes. One of the most noticeable signs is the increase in temperature, the heat wave that we feel. But why is that happening? So let's examine the major contributors to emissions. This chart depicts annual CO2 emissions, and as you can see, China is the major contributor to these emissions, and it followed by United States and India. So if we talk about India, it contributes around 3 billion tons of emissions out of around 60 billion tons as on date. So why it is happening, and what are the major factors, and what are the consequences of these emissions? So the consequence that we see, that we feel, is the increase in average temperature anomaly. So what is this? So if we compare the period of 1960 to 1990, then as compared to that period, the total mean temperature which has increased till this date is around 1.2 degrees centigrade. So as compared to 1960 to 1990 period, that 30 years of period, currently the earth is warmer. And as compared to this period, if we go back in industrial era, then the earth is slightly colder. So this chart depicts that because of the emissions, the temperature has increased globally. Moving on. So what are the major contributors? Why CO2 emissions has increased? So it has increased because of the consumption of various fuels like coal, oil and gas, and other industries like cement and flaring from various industries, etc. Moving on. So these are the emission sources that we consume. Like first, this picture is about the transport. Like the emission is contributed by the vehicle which we drive, and also by the aircraft through which we fly. So these are the emissions from transport sectors. Another industry which contributes majorly is the petrochemical. So the products which we use, so these are manufactured in the plants and in the industries. So they also consume various fuels, and they also consume electricity. So that's why it also emits a lot. The third sector is the power sector. So as we know that we consume electricity, and almost all the corporate offices, all the houses, all the commercial, etc., they consume electricity, and emissions from thermal power plants are huge. So it is also a big cause of emission. And fourth in the list is the agriculture activities and forest. So they also consume, they also contribute to the emissions. So these are not in the ascending or descending order, but these are the major contributor to the emissions. Now we have seen the GHG emissions, the reasons, but it's time to discuss the today's topic, that is how we classify GHG emissions in terms of industry point of view. So when we report GHG emissions, we classify it as Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. So what are Scope 1 emissions? So let's understand it through example. Let's take an example of steel industry. So Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions. So for steel industry, when they consume any fuel directly in their premises, and through which if emissions are generated, then it is called Scope 1 emissions. So companies use their company vehicles, in-house vehicles. Suppose for steel industry, when they transport iron ore, and if the vehicles are owned by the steel company, then the emissions generated by the vehicles is counted as Scope 1 emissions. And so Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions, and these are the emissions which are not contributed by the steel industry premise. So here steel industry is the example which we have taken, and steel industry steel plant, they consume electricity which they purchase from outside. So whenever emissions are happened outside of their industry boundary, it is called scope 2 emissions. And there are some examples like this electricity, steam, heating, cooling for their own use. So they have purchased it from outside, that's why it is scope 2 emissions, which have not happened within the plant boundary. Now let's discuss the scope 3 emissions. So again, it is indirect emissions. So now we will divide scope 3 emissions in two parts. One is the upstream activities and another is the downstream activities. So suppose a steel is a product, and if we want to understand scope 3 emissions in upstream activities, then the emissions which are generated from starting from extraction of raw materials to the production of the steels are called upstream activities, and the emissions through these activities are called scope 3 emissions. So here it is, like these are various contributor to the scope 3 emissions in upstream. One is like this purchase goods and services, capital goods, fuel and energy related activities, transportation and distribution. Through this, it can be through rail or through trucks like iron ore, etc., which goes to the plant, and when the final steel making process continues. Also the waste generated in operations, business travel by employees, etc. And now let's understand the downstream activities. Once the steel has been produced, manufactured, and when it is transported to the end consumers, so all the emissions which are associated with the downstream activities are called downstream activities emissions in scope 3. So which are processing of salt products, use of salt products, etc. So these are your downstream emissions in scope 3. So this is the entire graph of scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, and I have explained it through an example that is a steel industry. Moving on, what are scope 4 emissions? So this is a new term, and it's scope 4 emissions are nothing but reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that occur outside of a product's life cycle or value chain, but as a direct result of using that product and service. So I'll give you an example, like what are scope 4 emissions. So suppose a company manufactures energy efficient appliances, and the emissions avoided by consumers using this appliance compared to less efficient models. So these emissions fall under scope 4. So suppose if a company launch a bulb which is energy efficient. Earlier bulb was consuming more electricity, but this bulb is consuming less electricity. So whatever emissions are avoided are counted as scope 4 emissions. So this was all about GHG emissions and scope 1, 2, 3 and also for scope 4 emissions. So thank you guys for watching this video.